millions of dollars to untangle the spectrum from Inmarsat. We'll invest all this other money in putting up a $600 million more dollars to put up a next generation satellite, $50 million to develop integrated handsets, and $10 to $12 billion to build out towers and base stations all across the country. And by the way, we're going to reach all the people in rural areas that don't get rural broadband from the major carriers today. And so the FCC said, well, that sounds like a sweet deal. What do you need? And they said, well, as you recommended in the National Broadband Plan, what we need is flexibility to have to make this ground-based network, this terrestrial network, really the dominant part, in a sense, of the network. But we want to have a wholesale business model where we rent spectrum to all the other providers. So they're not going to have retail customers. They'll sell spectrum capacity to the other carriers. And companies that were, and the sort of the competitive companies that have been struggling, like T-Mobile and Sprint, and Metro PCS and Leap Cricket, were badly in need of that. So the commission was quite willing to go along with this, and that led, after a whole bunch of commitments that LightSquared had to make about a very rapid build-out nationwide of this terrestrial network, that led ultimately to this waiver.
And I think you spoke a little bit about the integrated service rule, and you were saying it has to do with providing both satellite and terrestrial connection. So it's required that all providers are able to do both? Can you speak a little bit more about what it does, what its purposes are?
Yeah, the integrated service rule, it came along, back, the commission adopted this in, after, of course, a notice and comment period and a proceeding and so on, in 2003. And that was where the mobile satellite providers, as I said, there were, like probably two each in the two bands, came in and said, hey, we can't make a go of this very well with satellite only, because cell phones are becoming much more sophisticated, and this is too expensive and limiting. And so they went through a whole process where, and a big part of that was actually negotiations with the GPS community about what would be the out-of-band emissions limits. And so the GPS Council and the Commerce Department's NTIA, which represents federal agencies, it manages federal spectrum on behalf of all the federal agencies. They all entered into all these negotiations about what would be the out-of-band emissions if the commission gave the mobile satellite industry a waiver to deploy not only satellite communication, but also ground communication, to cell towers at high power at the ground level. And so they all agreed, and in fact, the company's, LightSquared's predecessor, agreed to stronger, more strict out-of-band emission limits than the FCC had proposed, as a compromise. And so the GPS Industry Council, this is the so-called 2002 agreement, the GPS Industry Council and the NTIA signed off on these limits. And it was always anticipated, at least my impression was, it was always anticipated that there could be a massive build-out of these ATC base stations and mobile handsets. In other words, of the terrestrial component of a network. But suddenly that's become, as the reality of it is hitting, after this waiver, it's becoming, much more controversial.
And is that has to do with GPS industry being concerned about legitimate interference concerns? Because it seems like they agreed to a specific level of interference in 2002, or non-interference as they thought it would be. And is it that the build-out is bigger than they had previously anticipated, do you think? Or
yeah, apparently it's, well, I think probably several different things are going on. One of them is that I think probably when this all started, even though they've been on notice for 8 years that this was going to happen, I believe they thought that as long as the mobile satellite companies could not sell terrestrial only subscriptions, as long as they couldn't have retail customers who would not have to buy a phone with satellite capability, they thought that this would be a limited thing. In other words, there might be tens or hundreds of thousands of users spread around particularly rural areas, but not millions of users who might be clustered in urban areas in particular. And so what the waiver allows, it's really a business model waiver. It allows LightSquared to sell their integrated service on a wholesale basis to wireless carriers like T-Mobile or Sprint, who could then turn around and decide they only want to sell their customers the terrestrial component and not the satellite component, or to give people a choice. And so maybe a handful of people, maybe delivery companies in small towns, for example, might decide to take the service with the integrated handset. But there may be just ordinary customers who have a chip in their phone that will use this MSS L-band without using the satellite at all. And so the GPS companies have now come back in at the 11th hour and said, well, wait a second, nobody ever anticipated that it would be so easy to use the spectrum, that you could use it on a terrestrial only basis. And that means it really will be millions and millions of customers. And so the aggregate level of transmission will overload GPS receivers, many of which are cheap and too wide open. And it's interesting to note that although GPS is, I'm sure as you all know, is used in a whole wide range of things, so, some of the kind of most vociferous opposition is from the companies such as Garmin and Trimble that make the really cheap consumer grade GPS products. Because what they've done, and this is John Deere as another example, is they've tended to have really wide open receivers that are looking into LightSquared spectrum, even though they don't even pay LightSquared anything for that. And so they're saying, oh, well now if all these cell phones are transmitting on those same frequencies that we're using for GPS, it will overload our receivers. So they have a legitimate concern that a huge deployment could create interference, but the tougher question is, well, whose responsibility is it really when they agreed to these out-of-band emission limits, and LightSquared has said we will abide by those. We're not going to do anything that that's not in the rules. And they've been on notice for 8 years, but they've continued to manufacture these same products without better filters.
So how do you think it will play out? Do you think the FCC will uphold the waiver, and that maybe what happens is they regulate the number of subscribers that are able to purchase, terrestrial versus the MMS only, or what happens down the road?
Well, I think the FCC desperately wants this to go forward, wants to see this wholesale only network for wireless connectivity. And in fact, the stakes have gone up even further with the announcement last week that AT&T wants to acquire T-Mobile, so that AT&T and Verizon Wireless would have 80% of the market, because we really need more competition in mobile broadband, as well as more spectrum capacity.